And she just ran away. Our little class pet there, December. Hi, December. Where are you? Oh, she's at the other end. There she is. Good morning, December. You say hi? I think she's happy to see us. Now, December, I'm going to read a story for us, okay? Sound good? Okay. I think she sounded like she was alright with that. Story I'm going to share with us today is called The Grumpling. It's a cute little story by Stephen Cosgrove and illustrated by Robin James. And it says right down here, good manners are an important part of daily life. So, I think we're going to learn about being polite and having good manners. Alright, here we go. On the island of Serendipity, not far from the princess's castle, was a land called Amenity. Amenity was a gentle place, a proper place if you would, where the please trees rustled in the breeze that blew the pollen from the you're welcome weeds. It was a polite land where bunnies hopped about in bow ties and top hats, as others rustled about in lace shawls and bonnets. One of the bunnies that lived here was called Buttermilk. She was very polite, and her manners were impeccable. She always carried a hanky to stifle her sniffles, and she only smelled, never picked, the roses that grew in great profusion. Buttermilk was the pride of all, and the essence of amenity, as she politely said, "Excuse me," if she hiccuped or burped. Every afternoon at 2:45, all of the creatures that lived at Amenity stopped their busy bodies and gathered about stumps and logs, draped with lace-edged doilies. There they would sip a bit of dandelion tea and munch upon caramel crumpets and sugar crumb cookies. They would politely speak of the weather, or whether the owl would fly that moonlit night. All seemed perfectly polite in the land of Amenity. But all was not perfect in Amenity, nor were all the creatures polite, for every afternoon, at 2:45, just as tea was set and made cozy for drinking, there came the Grumpling. The Grumpling was an uncivilized bear of monstrous proportions, with a jutting jaw and a knitted brow. His hair seemed cast of wire, and never was combed or parted. He wore about his neck a tattered scarf that was rarely tied properly, if at all. The scarf, stuck here and there with bits of leaves and smudges of last night's supper, always trailed behind him as he stomped down the trail. He always showed up at 2:45, and though he never drank the tea, he would eat the cookies, all of the cookies, and crumpets, finger sandwiches, and after-tea mints. He probably would have eaten the doilies, but they were made of yarn and hardly digestible, even for the Grumpling. When finished, he would grumble about not having had enough to eat, and wipe his mouth on his scarf. Then, without a thank you or by your leave, he would belch a rumbling belch that shook birds from the trees, and off he would grump down the trail. None of the creatures of Amenity said anything, so polite were they. They would calmly pour their tea and pretend as if nothing had happened at all, although a lot happened indeed. One day, Buttermilk had finally taken all that she could take. It was bad enough that she had baked the night before, making a dozen or more of the most scrumptious crumpets, the mouth-watering kind, only to see the Grumpling stuff them all in his mouth. It was bad enough that she had made batches of cookies and 2 or 3 delightful little cakes, only to find that the Grumpling had eaten them all in one single bite. But when he didn't say thank you, or even They tasted great, Miss Buttermilk, ma'am. Buttermilk got angry, downright mad, if you please. She decided right then and there to tame that ill-mannered beast if it was the last thing she did. She rushed home to her burrow, and there, after tying her apron of ruffly ruffles firmly around her waist, she whisked and whipped this and that the whole night through. For Buttermilk realized that nobody had ever formally set a tea table for the Grumpling, or even actually invited him for that matter. She would bake the best of the best and invite the Grumpling for tea. Surely then he would be polite. She stirred up a batch of her most special crisp, crumbly crumpets and popped them in the oven. She ground broomwood seeds, oat, and bran into a fine flour that she mixed with buttonberries and marmalade. All of this was plopped into biscuit molds, and this too was popped into the oven. The very next day, at 2:45, Buttermilk set up her tea right in the middle of the trail, from whence would come the Grumpling. She laid down her fresh lace doilies, and upon them she set her best tea cozy, saucer, and cups. She laid out dainty little sandwiches, and the sweet biscuits she had. Lost my place. Hold on. There it is. The sweet biscuits of broomwood seed. She set 2 places at her table, one for the Grumpling and one for herself. At the Grumpling's plate she set a formal invitation, which she had written in the finest cursive lettering on linen paper with hand-cut frills. When all was set and ready, she sat down prim and proper and waited for the scrubby lout himself, the Grumpling. It wasn't long before she heard saucers rattling and saw crumbs flying as the Grumpling fed himself rudely on others' polite food. It was but a moment before the crude beast was upon her table, ready to ravage her food. He had only taken a bite or two before she rose and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Grumpling, sir, but won't you sit down and enjoy tea with me, like a gentleman should?" The Grumpling just looked at her with jam on his face and muttered, "What's the furniture?" As he spoke, Buttermilk was showered with a spray of crumpet crumbs and cookie bits. "I said," she said firmly but primly, "that you have been invited, and you shall sit down like a gentleman and sip tea in a civilized manner, or you shan't eat any more of my crumpets." The Grumpling looked at her. Shocked was he. Then he shook his head in a disdainful way and proceeded to eat all there was to eat, including the invitation, and this time he even ate the doilies. As he ate, Buttermilk stood boldly in the center of the path. "You rude, inconsiderate beast," she said, as her foot tapped in a staccato manner on the cobbled path. The Grumpling just looked at her with a bit of jam still on his nose and belched the rudest burp. Then he started on his way, as was his wont, but Buttermilk refused to move. "I will not move from this spot until you apologize and at least say thank you," she said, daring him to pass. Without a thought, without a care, the Grumpling roughly brushed past the poor little rabbit, rudely bumping her out of the way. Poor Buttermilk. She had tried so hard. She had baked and set the nicest table, but still the Grumpling was as rude as he could be. Tears began to stream down her cheeks as she cried and cried, so frustrated was she. But the Grumpling didn't go on as he had in the past. He stopped fast in his tracks as the little bunny was racked with sobs. He stomped back to where she sat in the moss, and while shuffling from one foot to the other, mumbled, Well, don't cry, Miss Buttermilk, ma'am. I am sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." And the forest rang with his apology. for it was the first polite thing the Grumpling had ever done. He reached down, and with the only clean spot on his scarf, he wiped away her tears. "You see, ma'am, I just don't know how to be polite. Nobody ever showed me, and I never have been invited. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings." It was then, and only then, that Buttermilk realized that the Grumpling didn't mean to be impolite. For how could one be impolite when one didn't know right from wrong? She began to see the Grumpling in a new, polite light. The Grumpling helped her to her feet, and Buttermilk asked courteously, "If someone would help you, would you be willing to learn the polite way, the right way, to carry yourself in the land of Amenity?" "Oh, yes, ma'am," he said in a low, rumbling voice. Hand in hand, they set off down the cobbled path to Buttermilk's burrow in the woods. From that day forward, Buttermilk and the Grumpling were the fastest of friends. She taught him how to lay his napkin on his lap, and not to wrap it around his neck. She taught him how and when to say please and thank you. She even washed his scarf with soap and bleach, pressed it flat, and pleated it. The Grumpling even learned to tie it in a rakish way, a polite and proper sort of thing to do when you have tea at 3:15. For in the rudest of people there is always convention, if we would only take time to teach it. As you live and as you grow in the land of Amenity, be polite and gracious too, and you never will a Grumpling be. And that's the end. And there's the author and illustrator. But anyway, this book kind of reminds me of some scripture. It was in my mind a moment ago. So what we call the golden rule. Jesus said to do to other people the way you'd want them to do towards you. And so just like Buttermilk in our story, just like Buttermilk in our story was showing kindness to the Grumpling just the way she would like him to show kindness to her, it was the first time he'd ever had that extended towards him. It's really difficult whenever someone's being difficult with you to be kind back to them. But Jesus was also very clear to do good to those who are rude to you or who are spiteful towards you. And the Bible even says to feed your enemies, pray for them. So I want to encourage you, just like we saw Buttermilk being kind towards the Grumpling, and then we saw the Grumpling changed his heart and changed his ways, that we need to show the love and kindness of Jesus to everybody around us, no matter whether or not they deserve it or whether they show it back, and just trust that we are doing the right thing and that the Lord is going to work on their heart also. So anyway, have a great day.